Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the special interview. Today we have a returning guest to the show, Charles Hugh Smith from Of Two Minds, located at of2minds.com. And I got to tell you, not many people can talk about current events in the markets or the economy and make you laugh. And not many people can talk about current events in the markets and the economy and make you think. But Charles Hugh Smith can do both of those things with every single thing that he writes. You need to be checking out Of Two Minds daily to stay up on current events. Charles, I'd like to thank you for returning again to Silver Doctors.
Thank you, Paul. It's my pleasure.
Now, Charles, I still can't find any toilet paper for the life of me. I'm trying to make purchases at Walmart online. I'm going to my local Costco. I'm going to my local Aldi's. On Monday night, I talked to my dad in Florida, and he can't find any toilet paper. So I guess, Charles, my question to start this out, and I don't want to make it sound crappy or not, but do you have toilet paper in Hawaii, or how are you doing, and how is it going in Hawaii right now, Charles?
Well, that's a great question, Paul. And, I'm on the big island of Hawaii, which has only about 200,000 people. So, it's a fairly small community. And so people, people here aren't really that much into hoarding. And so when we went to Costco, then they were out for a couple hours. But, we didn't see people backing up their pickup truck and trying to take the whole inventory. So I guess it kind of depends on how much kind of like community spirit your locale has. And so, of course, smaller cities, smaller towns, they're more likely to have that kind of sense of sharing. So we're doing okay. Now, I will say that Hawaii's economy is totally dependent on tourism, right? And so that's like dropped 99%. So Main Street Hawaii and even Big Hotel Hawaii, they're facing what can we say, unprecedented challenges going forward. And the positive part of it is then it allows us to all to rethink, well, what kind of economy do we want? And do we want something a little different than the version that's died?
Mm-hmm.
And
that's a great point, and I'm glad to hear that you're faring okay. And yes, we're going to talk about those hopeful things at the end, but just like the economy, we got to talk about the bad stuff first, Charles. So let's dive into this. And it's interesting because, a lot of people don't know this, but I worked on the CDC's National HIV and STD hotline. And I also worked on the National Institutes of Health Immunization Vaccine Information Hotline for 3.5 years, many, many moons ago. So I have a unique perspective for this whole coronavirus pandemic that we're all dealing with. And it's interesting because for a while there was the whole it's no big deal. Then it was, oh my gosh, everybody's going to die. Now it seems like it's no big deal again. People are ready to just move on. So I guess my question for you is, what is your assessment right now as far as, are you erring on the side where, we need to focus all our attention on the economy again? Or are you focusing more on the side, well, we need to have a little bit more caution? Or how are you seeing things in relation to coronavirus and the havoc it's wreaking on the economy?
Well, a great topic, Paul. And actually, I should be asking you for your insights because you have that background in exactly this field. But from my point of view, as somebody that's kind of an alternative media, observer of the economy, kind of what I'm looking at is there's really like two groups in America now, and we're used to having this kind of polarity, right? Democrats, Republicans, and that kind of thing. But actually, I think now what we need to be looking at is the group of Americans who feel at risk. And of course, would be people over the age of 60, people with some health issues, and certain ethnic groups that seem to have a higher rate of serious infection. And so we got all these conditions that are separating out the Americans who feel that they're potentially at risk of this, and then a much larger group of younger people who are statistically much less at risk, right? And so we can kind of see that we need to have a two-track kind of way of dealing with this. So in other words, we can say, well, we got to reopen the economy for everybody who doesn't feel at risk, right? Or who's at low risk, and just kind of common sense stuff like wearing a mask. Hey, people in Asia wear masks all the time, right? They've worn masks for decades when they've had a cold or whatever. Nobody thinks anything of it. So maybe we can kind of transition to that. without having to go to, we're all going to get chips implanted in our heads and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there may be just some really basic common sense things we can do to reopen the economy for people who don't feel at risk. For those people who do feel at risk, that's going to be another level. And so for, say, nursing homes, we may just have to restrict guests, like maybe I won't be able to visit my 90-year-old mom without going through some kind of screening process or wearing a mask or something, but that's to protect the residents. So why not? I don't think it's a big stumbling block. But one of the stumbling blocks is, the people who have the most money generally are over the age of 60. They're the ones who book the cruises and the $5,000 a week resorts and all that kind of stuff. Younger people who've seen their incomes, stagnate for decades, they don't have the same, disposable income. So I think that the fact that the older population is the one who's going to be more hesitant and cautious about getting out there and spending a ton of money, that's going to impact the economy to a, sort of asymmetric degree. In other words, the top 10% of American households are responsible for almost half of all consumer spending. So, in other words, it's that group with the money that hire the dog walkers to get their hair done and, have tutors for their kids and hire a personal attendant for their elderly parents and, all that kind of service sector stuff. So I'm afraid that the economy is going to take a much bigger hit than most people expect.
That's a good point there. I hadn't even thought about the fact that there's the difference in who is spending more at what age bracket, and then the target group that is spending more that you want out there spending the money are the ones that are most at risk. Now let's stay on the economy here for a while, Charles, and let's talk about inflation, inflation, deflation, or inflation, hyperinflation, or stagflation, or however you want to talk about it. Then we'll also talk about jobs, but let's first talk about inflation for a second here, because I know you have a lot of things to say about this. It amazes me that the inflation deflation debate, that's a tongue twister, is still going on to this day, because you look at the Fed's balance sheet and it's just shot up vertically. That's beside the point. Here's my point. I think about all of just the product of cheap money. And when I say that, I mean, we can go to Applebee's and get $9.99 meals and get full because of cheap money keeping these companies in business. Or you think about the tax benefits for buying an electric vehicle. So you can go out and get something that you otherwise couldn't afford. Or, for example, all of the companies that keep going bankrupt or they're on the verge of bankruptcy, but they're still offering these low-cost goods, such as JCPenney's and Sears and other retail outlets. Well, if we actually do let the creative destruction happen this time, when people go out to eat dinner again, they're not going to be able to find those $9.99 meals. They're not going to be able to find those $19.99 jeans, and they're not going to be able to find those big rebates for buying electrical vehicles. So my question, Charles, to you is, how do you see inflation or deflation or stagflation, or how do you see things playing out when it comes to consumer prices for goods and services?
Great topic, Paul, and a good way to focus on the consumer part of it, because you and I and many other commentators have focused on the fact that we've had huge inflation, but it's in assets, right? Suddenly, the house that used to be 150,000 is now 750,000. I mean, these ridiculous, insane levels of assets have inflated, right? The house is still providing the same shelter it did a decade ago, but now it costs 4 or 5 times more. I mean, so we've had huge inflation in assets, which everybody loves, because guess what? If you own those assets, you feel richer, right? It's called the wealth effect, right? You look at that and you go, wow, my stocks are up in my 401k and my house has doubled in value. So I'm going to go out and buy a new SUV or take a luxury vacation because, hey, I feel richer, right? So we've seen inflation there, but you know what? As people like you and I know, only the top 10% own like 85 to 90% of all those assets. So most people don't own enough of those assets that have inflated to feel a lot richer. And so they're kind of been left behind by this wealth effect, right? But in terms of like consumer goods, like TVs and shoes and appliances and stuff like that, we've seen a low rate of inflation. But there's 2 factors in there that most people may not be thinking about. One is that a lot of that stuff is made in China or other Asian countries, and it's not that it's necessarily um, like cheaper if we count everything, including like the pollution that we can dump in those countries, and the fact that it's really just currency arbitrage. In other words, like if China didn't peg its currency, the yuan, to the dollar just by fiat, in other words, the Chinese government says this is what the yuan's worth, and if it was allowed to float, then it might turn out that it's not cheaper at all to have anything made in China. So in other words, it's a currency situation as to why that we say, oh, financially it's cheaper. But that, in other words, there's something arbitrary about that. It's not necessarily real. It's what you're going to peg your money at that creates that illusion of cheapness. Now, the other thing is that I like to talk about and is shrinkflation, right? And a degrading of quality. Now, and so the price tag looks the same. So you go, oh, well, inflation's low. But if you look at your cereal box, it used to have like, 20 ounces of contents. Now it's like 14. The box is so narrow, it can't even stand up by itself. I mean, it's like an inch and a quarter wide. And that's in everything, right? Shrinkflation is how corporate America's dealt with higher costs. It's reduced increased the package size and reduced the contents. And it's also dramatically lowered quality. I can't tell you how many appliances that I know of or that I've bought from name brands, GE and stuff like that, Whirlpool. They've broken, some defective sensor goes out in the first year, and it costs hundreds of dollars to replace it because, oh, well, the warranty, of course, always runs out, right? And so there's a huge loss of value that's being hidden in shrinkflation and a degradation of quality. So my point here being is the appearance of inflation being low, it's really an illusion. If we put a value on quality, how long things used to last, and the quantity of what we're getting, then we'd say, wow, we've actually lost a lot of purchasing power already. But so that's kind of my take. And but if you look at what's going to happen in global trade, that a lot of that's going to dry up and blow away because it doesn't make sense anymore. Then we're going to have higher prices regardless of who's manipulating what currency.
And that brings up a very interesting point, because if I'm understanding this correctly, like I personally feel that they've shrunk things down to the point where, well, they can't even really go any more with this.
Yes.
So the only way to go is up in price. I mean, because you can only, make the cereal so small before it ends up being snack size, right? So that's very interesting. I find that very interesting there. And also about the currency arbitrage, just as a side note, I remember back in 2014, and that's another thing that's hidden the inflation, is the value of the dollar, which is interesting why you're bringing up the currency. Because I remember I lived in El Paso at the time, and when the dollar went on the tear from about June of 2014, and then it shot up over 100 on the DXY. I think it got up to 120, but don't quote me on that. I can't remember exactly. But here's my point with that. The peso, and to this day, now it's even worse. Now it's like 25. It's been 25 pesos to the dollar. But my point was this. I was seriously considering, and as a matter of fact, the day I was considering this was actually the election, because that's when the peso shot up to like 22 or something like that. I could have gone into Mexico to Juarez, right across the border, purchased a brand new Chevrolet four-door subcompact. They call them a Chevy, Chevy. That's the model they sell there in Mexico, for $7,500. And I was seriously thinking of just driving it back into the States, because it's an open border like that where you can go through the checkpoints, and then just driving it, not registering it or anything. And then, if it just gets confiscated or whatever in a few years, then oh well. But this is the kind of arbitrage that you're talking about, where decisions are made based on cheap money and the different types of plays where something gets out of whack, and all of a sudden there's brand new Chevrolets for sale for $7,500 across the border. Did any of that make sense at all, Charles?
Absolutely. And because you lived on the border, then better than I how many people go to get their dental work done or their eyewear in Mexico, because that's the only way they can afford it.
Yes, yes, yes. My wife can show you a couple crowns and a couple $1,000 that would have had several digits in it here in the United States. So yes, you're absolutely right about that. As far as jobs, this fascinates me too. And I want to talk about this also at the end when we talk about hope, because I know you have some things to say about there. But when I think about jobs, everybody's talking about a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped recovery. And, ADP just came out today and we're talking about 20 million jobs lost. The government's Bureau of Labor Statistics comes out on Friday. So we'll see what the headline number is there. But here's my point. That's just in April. 20 million jobs gone, vanished. And then I think of what it takes to get a job, right? Like, there's an application process. It's open, on application for a month, and then they're going to go through a round of interviews, and then they're going to go through a round of selections, and then you got to go in and do your credit checks and your background checks and your drug tests and your this and that. And to get meaningful employment in 2020 up to this point, it has been several hoops that a person has to go through just to get employed. So my question to you is, if the jobs just vanished like that, and if I'm right that, it's not just like I can go in and get meaningful employment tomorrow and start working on Monday, how do we get any kind of recovery at all that's any way fast or U-shaped at all when it takes so much just to get the jobs, in addition to the increased competition from all the other people that are now jobless?
Yeah, that is a wrenching and immediate problem, Paul. And I think I'm going to take a start by looking at the other side of the employment picture, which is the employer, right? Now, we all know that big corporations and the government have different standards, but a lot of the employment in the U.S. is small businesses, which are just like regular folks like you and I. And so they're now being crunched, right? Main Street has really been hit hard. And so if you look at it from the point of view of the employer, how good does it have to get before they can hire anybody back? Because if you're just struggling to pay your rent and your insurance and your, licensing fees and all this other compliance stuff, they cost thousands of bucks, right? Then you may not be able to hire back even half of the people that you had to let go, right? Or you can only hire them back as business improves to the point where you can afford it. And I thought you made a really good point about you can't shrink the cereal box anymore. Well, you can't cut your labor costs anymore either. In other words, everybody's, you go to a fast food place, people are working flat out. I mean, there's no slack there, right? In a lot of jobs. And so you can't say, well, we're going to cut people's hours and all that. They've already done all that, they've already cut benefits. And so there's no way that a business can cut anymore. They're going to have to, as you say, raise prices. That's the only way they can afford to hire people back, right? And so as employers, we know that about 40% of our costs are hidden from the employee, right? Because there's workers' comp, there's liability insurance, there's all, and there's social security taxes, and there's all these expenses that we call overhead, labor overhead. So if the employee is looking at getting 15 an hour, well, the employer is paying 20 or 25, depending on their health insurance coverage. So it's quite a barrier to a V-shaped recovery. And it's another topic real quick, Paul, is, a lot of small businesses were struggling before the pandemic, because their expenses have been rising.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you bring that up from the employer point of view, because that makes me think about something else as not only do the costs have to go up, but now there's added costs that weren't there just a few months ago. And what do I mean by that? Well, now they're going to be furnishing their employees with masks, right? And hand sanitizer at their entrances and exits, I'm sure. And they're talking about, separating cash registers or installing plexiglass, adding additional time, which either means closing early or staying extra to clean and sanitize. There are a whole number of things that are costs now for the employer that weren't there just a few months ago on top of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, my sister was telling me that she read something that said the airlines are going to have to raise prices when they reopen. And you go, well, why is that? Isn't it the same, cost? But actually, as a business, you realize your overhead, your all your expenses for accounting and management and all this other stuff, those stay the same. If you used to run 1,000 flights and now you're only running 100, well, you're going to have to make it so that those 100 flights pay all of your corporate overhead. So you're going to have to raise prices. And so it's interesting that between the two of us, we've listed like a half dozen reasons why prices are going to go up.
Hmm. Hmm.
And they're from all over the economy. They're like the disruption of global trade, the ending of currency arbitrage, the fact that there's no more shrinkflation. It's already been reduced to bare bones. There's no way to cut labor costs. I mean, on and on and on. There's all these reasons that are going to pile up to where there's going to have to be cost increases. And as you said, and I want to touch on this real quick, is you said the source of all this has been cheap money. In other words, why do people feel they can go out and have a nice meal or go on a vacation? It's because they can put it on their credit card.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yes.
now the banks are tightening up because they can't afford to basically risk the fact that people will default on those credit cards.
Hmm. And it actually started getting tight, I recall, a year ago, I think, and not even September. I'm talking about before then, because we purchased our third house. Not that we own three now, but the third house we've ever purchased. But and I remember we just went with a conventional mortgage. Could have got a VA, but we went with a conventional mortgage. And the point there is that we could already see that they were slowly, incrementally, hey, you need another 20,000. So we could already see those already starting last May when we bought the house. This ratcheting of like limiting the credit there, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
And did you have to sign like a half inch of paperwork? And remember your first house, it was like, I don't know, 6 pages.
Yeah,
And now
yeah.
it's dozens and dozens of pages. It's like, this is insane.
Yeah, and nobody could even read them because it takes you an hour, right, just to sign them. So, you can't even skim the paperwork now. Um, Charles, one of the things we haven't talked about, which has to do a lot with prices that we're seeing and availability of goods, is another thing to add on there are the supply chain disruptions. And supply chain disruptions we can talk about globally. Like for example, in the gold and silver markets, we've seen that there are disruptions on every link of the chain, right? You've got mines that are shut down, you've got logistics problems with getting gold and silver around the world, then you've got refiners that are shut down, you've got mints that are shut down. So all of these are added breakdowns in the supply chain. Or we can talk about like the national supply chain when we're talking about like farmers are having to cull their herds, right? They're euthanizing their cattle. And I was reading an article the other day saying this is essentially the same thing as having a negative price for crude oil, because you're saying it's more expensive to keep the cow alive than to just euthanize them. And starving people and famines aside, that's what's going on. So there's all these supply chain disruptions that I see that are also pointing to A, higher prices, and B, scarcer availability of goods. So when you're thinking and looking at the supply chain, what are some of the things you're thinking about and you're looking at, Charles?
Wow, you did a great summary there of the issue here, which is that there's plenty of that commodity out there, but we're not able to get it into the supply chains, and why is that? And it's like, well, what we're discovering is in this relentless drive to increase corporate profits by any means available, then it's like it's led to these efficiencies where, like, well, let's just not have 10 slaughterhouses, let's have one, because then we can consolidate and we can lower costs and all that stuff. So we end up with these huge concentrations where six media companies own virtually everything in the way of mainstream media. We have like a handful of tech giants, which are basically monopolies. We have a handful of big banks that control most of the mortgage markets and all that stuff. So we've allowed our economy to be concentrated in these handful of big companies and facilities. And so when one of those facilities goes down, it disrupts the whole network. And so, a lot of people know about this idea of the black swan, which was from Nassim Taleb's book, and his latest book is called Anti-Fragile, and he's kind of talking about what we're talking about, which is, he said, if you set up your system to where one node in the network goes down and it takes down your entire network, that's a really fragile system. And so an anti-fragile system is one that can handle shocks and disruptions And that generally means it's decentralized, the way that the U.S. economy used to be. Like there used to be 5,000 places that slaughtered and trimmed, animals, and now there's like 50 or something. And so that's the problem is we need to decentralize our economy, and it's going to be less efficient. But then you're gaining that resiliency, and you're gaining what I call intangible capital. Like everybody measures dollars and cents in profits, that's tangible. But your food security that's like it's intangible. You go, well, how do we price that? And go, well, it's just super valuable, to have a food supply chain that's resilient and secure, but you can't put a price tag on it. And so that's what we're sort of realizing now as a nation. Hey, we need to get like our high tech industry back. We need to secure our food sources, and to heck with corporate profits as being the only guide to efficiency.
I think it brings to mind something like in computers you can put hard drives in a disk array where you can have it so a little bit gets written to each disk, so that if one of the disks goes out, it can rewrite itself and repair it when you add a new disk into it, so that with one thing, when one of those nodes goes down, it doesn't affect the system as a whole. That's a very interesting point you bring up. Now, but on the other hand, Charles, it seems like, whether it's the Fed or whether it's our government in Washington, they're just going to start throwing money at this. That's the only solution that anybody can come up with. I think you have a great point about, maybe the incentive should be, rebuilding our infrastructure when it comes to the supply chains again. But it seems like all the Fed and all the government wants to do is throw money at this. So, what is your assessment of the fiscal and the monetary responses that we've had so far?
Well, great topic. And, of course, you're well versed in the history of money. And, I'm a student of it too. And when we look back at history, we look for an example. Is there ever been a situation where a government or a central bank just prints money like out of thin air in endless amounts and it doesn't cause inflation? And the answer is no. Yeah. Because, it's kind of like my example is always, well, then let's just say we're going to add a zero to everything. Instead of making $15 an hour, you're now making 150, right? And so on. And then it's like, well, is the loaf of bread still going to be $5? No, it's going to be $50. So what did you get for adding that zero? And of course, when we're talking about the supply chain and the loss of income and the closure of businesses and all this stuff, we're talking about the production of goods and services, the real world economy shrinking. So when you have your GDP shrinking, but your money supply is skyrocketing by trillions of dollars, then it's going to be this huge amount of money is going to be chasing a smaller amount of goods and services. And that's the explanation for how inflation comes about. And the more asymmetric that becomes, the higher your rate of inflation. And, one thing that worries me is our economy and financial system is not set up for rampant inflation. It likes a little bit of inflation so that we can pay back our loans with cheaper money and all that, but it's not set up to handle 10, 15, 20% inflation a year. That just destroys everything. And so that's where they're playing with fire here, printing endless trillions. And you go, well, when is it going to stop? And it's like, well, probably never, right? It's like it's all supposed to be an emergency thing, but who's going to pay all the unemployment and next year?
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. And one of the things that this makes me think about with the rampant inflation is, if it's true, which I believe, right? And I think if you would ask like John Williams, the Shaddistat, he would say the same thing. But if you believe that the government has been understating inflation already for decades even, then that means that once the inflation starts taking off, once the government acknowledges it, it's already too late because it'll already be wound up and spiraling out of control at that point. Did you have anything you wanted to add on to that, or does that sound like I'm thinking about that right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's an index, and I can't recall the name. It's not John Williams' work, but it's another firm that basically said, okay, we're going to get to the bottom of this inflation question. We're going to look at each city, and look at prices only in that city over the last, 10 years or something. So you're not mixing up a bunch of stuff and And
I
so
think
you're going
that's
to
called
get
the
a,
Chapwood Index.
that's right. Excellent. Thank you. The Chapwood
I was
Index.
thinking you were going to pull out the burrito index on me, but I remember that one now, the Chapwood or the Chaplin or something like that.
Yeah, no, it's right. Chapwood. Well, then it turns out, to your point, it's like in all the big cities of America, inflation is actually running at 9 to 13% a year. And when you include rent and taxes and fees and food and all the everything else, it's all like it's already at 10%. So as you say, once that's acknowledged, it'll probably actually be running at 15 or 20%. And real quick point here, you can say, well, what's gee, 15%, that doesn't sound so high. Yeah, but do that for 5 years. You've just lost like 75% of the value of your money. And unless you're making 15% more in wages, then you're losing ground incredibly fast at even 10% inflation. And if you're old like me, I remember the 70s. And when it kicked up to 10 or 12%, it was starting to just destroy the economy. It starts dismantling everything because you can't keep up.
Very interesting. And back in the 70s, was it like 10% or was it 15% that was common to have as far as like a mortgage on a house? Because I remember, what are Americans going to do when not only do they have to have a down payment, but the interest rate they're paying on a house is 10 to 15%. I mean, something has to give here, Charles.
Right. Even if it went back to the mid 90s, when a mortgage was about 7 or 7.5, it's like, well, anything above 3.5, we can't afford. Right. Well, we know what happens is you have to drop the price of the house. That $500,000 house. Well, guess what? It's only affordable at 200,000 now.
Yeah, and the way to think about that is like, when people go in and they just sign away for those cars, and then it's like, well, how much are you planning on paying? That's the question, right? So then they adjust the interest rate or they adjust the price accordingly to just how much they can get you for month by month, which seems very peculiar now that we have the coronavirus going on. Charles, last topic here today. I just wanted to talk to you just about where you see hope and opportunity in the economy, because, for example, and maybe you can speak to one of your recent books about this, because my understanding is you've looked at a few different ways that people can be nimble and move and survive in this kind of environment. For example, but here's one of the problems, though, right? One of the problems is, there's the gig economy, but now Uber's crashing and now Airbnb is crashing. So it's like, well, this was an opportunity for an income stream, but now that stream is gone. And then you think, well, that just opens things like DoorDash. But all of a sudden, Walmart is delivering groceries to your door the very next day for free. So that might not work out either. So, to not finish on a sour note here, Charles, what are you hopeful about? Where do you see opportunities about? And as far as like the individual and as far as like the country as a whole?
Yeah, well, that's a great topic, Paul. Thank you for bringing it up. And it's hard to be hopeful right now when you're looking at like 30 million jobs lost. And I'm not sure they're going to all come back. It might be that 50 million jobs are eventually lost and 25 million come back, but the other 25 are gone forever. And so what are we going to do with our populace that's going to help the country, And so, the answer is universal basic income, like give everybody the $1,000 a month. And then, but you know what? That's just basically making people scrape by. It's not something we're not going to be getting ahead as individuals or a nation by just kind of letting everybody scrape by. We want to do better than just scrape by, right? So I see two things. One, as a country, we have these huge bloated, cartels and monopolies. One is called higher education, right? Like this ripoff where you're supposed to pay $100,000 for a degree that really doesn't have a whole lot of value. Oh, and then you're supposed to spend another 100 and get another graduate degree. Well, that doesn't have enough value either. So it's like that industry is just ripe for innovation, right? And the same thing for healthcare. It's ripe for innovation.
Oh, I've got to tell you this story, Charles. I've got to tell you this story because I can relate to what you're saying exactly when I think about it this way. After the Army, I have a degree from UNC, a bachelor's degree. But after the Army, I went to school again on Uncle Sam's dime to study information systems and security, right? Computer networking, security, hardware, software, all that good stuff. Got some certificates as well. But here's the thing, right? That school was a private school and it was a 2-year associate's degree. No room and no board, no anything. Just basically like a community college. But that school was, for that program, $42,000 for a 2-year program. for an associate's degree. Now, here's my point about that, which is what you're highlighting, is, what they do, they're sneaky about this, right? They know the government's going to pay up to X amount. So what they do is, well, if the government's going to pay $42,000, they're going to give the price at $52,000, and then they're going to give veterans a discount, because they like to look after the veterans, so that the price they ultimately charge you is $42,000. So then what happens is the government says, oh my goodness, everybody's paying $42,000. We're going to have to up it a little bit so that we pay more so people can keep going to college. So then the college sees that, oh, well, now the government's paying $45,000. So now the college says, we're going to raise it to $55,000 and give you a discount. And they're still getting the full penny from Uncle Sam. So it's like, yes, a perversion to no end that just drives me crazy, because, I look at it and I'm not even working in the field that I studied after college the second time around. Did any of that make sense, Charles?
Absolutely. Yeah. And you can say the same thing. There's endless stories of that in healthcare too, right? Where, they say, well, Medicare will pay 80,000, so we're going to bill the patient 120,000. But actually, we're happy to take the government's 80,000. And was it necessary? Well, heck no. We just needed the money. So anyways, there's huge opportunities to innovate and reduce the cost in those things, and that's going to be painful to people who are making big bucks in those monopolies, but it's going to be better for the country. And I think even national defense, like we're starting to look at like, well, do we really need these these fighter aircraft that cost like $250 million each, when a drone that's more capable because it doesn't have a human pilot is a fraction of that, So there's a lot of disruption that's going to create opportunity and more efficiency, like we can't keep squandering all of our money and then print like another 10 or 20 trillion to make up for the fact that we're horribly inefficient, right? As for individuals, the opportunities I'm seeing is how can we cut our expenses, to where, and people have already been, sharing apartments and everything. But I kind of look at it and go, well, maybe it's going to be a thing where people are going to go, well, hey, is that barn empty on your farm? How about if I just fix it up and you let me, help you here and basically forge lifestyles where you feel like you're doing something meaningful. You're not making $100,000 a year, but you're able to get by and save a little money, and you're doing something useful. And so and it's like, well, that sounds easy to say, but I can, from my own experience, hey, I built like, like a cabin with hand saws and stuff. We didn't even have electrical power, and I dug my own pit toilet. And, it's like, it's not like, oh, that's a horrible existence. If you're making progress, you're growing food for people or raising animals. I mean, there's a lot of work out there that we've sort of either overlooked or turned into a factory model, that we could, if we decentralize, it's going to create more jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And when I hear the factory model, I'm thinking of, that Pink Floyd song, Brick in the Wall, and I'm thinking of our higher education system just churning people through the factory like that, Charles. Now, Charles, last question. As we go through the month of May here and we start getting in thinking about summer, I just want to know, what are you going to be looking at over the next month here as we start to move from spring into summer? What are some of the things that are on your radar right now that you're going to be looking closely at as we go through the next month?
Right. Good. Okay. Excellent idea to pursue. One of the things I'm looking at is, we all know there's this huge disconnect between Wall Street, which is like, the big tech monopolies are now at all-time highs and stuff, like, yay, Apple. And it's all like, well, yeah, okay, Apple's nice, and they make a nice phone, but how many people need $1,000 phone? Okay. I mean, and how many of those unemployed people are going to pony up $800 for a new, iPhone? So it's kind of like there's a disconnect. Like Wall Street's dumping all this Fed money into these big stocks, and stocks are going up, but the Main Street is still, as you say, looking at a much slower recovery. So I think one or the other, it has to connect. Either the economy does in fact go into a V-shaped recovery and Main Street climbs back up to where Wall Street is, or Wall Street has to drop down to reality. And I think that's one thing I'm looking at. Another one is, we're still learning a lot about the pandemic. That it has this virus has a lot of weird effects in a small group of people, right? And so it doesn't seem to affect most people. So that's the good news. But the bad news is it's doing a lot of weird, bad stuff to some people, in terms of their recovery is really slow. They might be able to, might not be immune despite already having it. So there's a lot of research that will be done that will help us understand the virus better, and then we'll be able to, take, precautions to protect those people who are at risk. So I'm looking at advancing our understanding of the virus, right? And then that'll help us adjust to it. And then I'm also looking at with some fear, actually, or hesitation, maybe we get a second wave in fall, right? Because that's what the 1918 pandemic did, right? It cooled off in summer, everybody got hopeful, and then it slammed the world even harder. And we can't discount that, because these kinds of viruses mutate quickly, right? And we're already talking about recognizing the East Coast version was a lot more impactful than the one that was on the West Coast. And so we could see that kind of thing, where a more contagious version erupts somewhere and starts spreading. So we're not out of the danger zone yet in terms of impact on the economy and on individuals. So those are the things I'm looking at.
And when people go to of2minds.com, Charles, what do you want people to get out of your site?
Well, I would like them to scan my recent books. There's free chapters that they can kind of get an idea of my thinking by downloading a free sample of my books. And I want them to come away feeling like dealing with reality is hopeful. Like, denial is not hopeful. Acting like we don't have any issues or problems is not making the issues or problems go away. We need to face them directly. And it's really a relief when you do that,
Charles Hugh Smith, I'd like to thank you for joining us again on Silver Doctors.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our discussion.